There we go. It's recording now.
Thank you, Catherine. Welcome, everyone, to our 7th installment of the Technology in Context series. Today, we will be talking about new technologies and democracy. My name is Oliver Buechse. I am the executive in residence at UWGB for the Cofrin School of Business and also the CEO of my own company, Advancing Digital. In my preparation for today, talking about new technologies and democracy, I realized that this is a humongous topic. There are entire conferences being held on aspects of that. So it was a bit of a challenge to condense this down to 1 hour, but I chose to take 4 perspectives on it. To ground ourselves, just for a moment, I took the definition of democracy, right? And there's obviously multiple definitions. It refers to the system of government, or it refers to the state that is governed by a democracy. But then it also refers to some principles like majority rule or social equality. So we'll come back to that a little bit later on. The 4 perspectives I've chosen is technology without democracy. We're going to look at some systems that we would not classify as democratic and how they are using technology to advance their cause. Then I'm going to flip this around and I say, what would make technology itself actually democratic? And can we find examples of that? Then we're going to get to the biggest segment, examining the pillars of our democracy, such as free speech, equality, and so forth. And ultimately, the final, somewhat shorter segment will describe how democracy can actually emerge as a shaping force for technology. As always, if you have any questions or comments, feel free to unmute and speak up or put it in the chat, and Catherine will keep an eye on that. So let's start with technology without democracy. And I'm going to talk a lot about China. And I'll explain to you why exactly. But first, let's look at a couple of examples. In 2019, during the protests in Hong Kong, protesters were destroying lampposts because those were not ordinary lampposts. They were smart lampposts that had security cameras mounted on them. And those security cameras were connected to a facial recognition software through which the government was assessing who was participating at the protests. They had not necessarily put those lampposts up solely for that purpose, but they were clearly able to use it. The use of facial recognition in China is fairly widespread. In the interest of public safety, they've put cameras in a lot of places. And once you have a high resolution picture, a stream, essentially, you can just analyze what you're seeing on that stream with a facial recognition software. And so what can you do with that? Well, at a minimum, you can know who is doing what in which public places. Now, China takes it a level further. China is not only seeing what people do, but they are using this to identify and track minority individuals. The Uyghurs, for example, if they have some distinctive features or if they are known to the system, the government is using that to track them. And then it goes on the other end of the spectrum all the way to shaming individuals for minor offenses. So if you step out into a public place in what the government would deem your sleepwear, your pajamas, they may publish your name and the picture to shame you for doing so. And what they're trying to do is essentially establish a social norm of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. It reminded me a little bit of the medieval tactics of sort of flogging someone or putting someone in a chokehold in the middle of the marketplace that everybody could see that they had violated some law or social norms. Now it's being done with the means of technology. Security cameras are not the only way in which they are collecting information. So police officers also wear smart glasses. Now, I don't know if they're using that more sort of as a camera feed into the central system, but they can display, once the glasses or the system recognizes an individual, they can display that into the glasses of the police officer and essentially have them make an arrest on the spot. So if facial recognition and a widespread use of that is an issue, then the next one is probably really going to be creepy, and that is emotion recognition. With essentially the same technology, just slightly different parameters, you cannot only identify who is a person, but you could discern what is their emotional state. As we move our facial muscles to express emotions, we display certain patterns. And you can analyze those patterns and you can say with a fairly high likelihood, is somebody happy or sad or angry and so forth. And so now the question is, what are you going to do with that? The government essentially wants to convey sort of a sense of optimism. And, imagine that you cannot be yourself in public. You cannot have a frown on your face, or you need to fear repercussions of that. So that's, to me, really an intrusive use of technology. But wait, there's more, right? To take this whole thing a level further, the government is now not only sort of analyzing what is happening in the moment, but it is essentially creating a score for individuals. And here's how this works. This was originally designed as an alternative to credit scores, because in China, people really never had an opportunity to take out loans. This is a fairly new phenomenon. So to avoid losses or abuse of this new ability to take out credit, they wanted to have a system, and they had a competition, and the company called Ant, run by Jack Ma, which also owns Alibaba, the sort of Amazon of China, they won with their Sesame credit. And they were not using only a history of financial behavior, but they were using a wide range of behaviors. And so that could include, things you've done in the past. This could include who you know and maybe what is on their record. Are they known to be a criminal, or maybe have they spoken up against the government? So there's a wide range of criteria that are being used here, and people have scores. And if your score dips below a certain level, you could be prohibited from attending a university or sending your children to university. You could be prohibited from purchasing certain luxury items. You could even be prohibited from using public transportation. You will not be admitted on the train if your social credit score is too low. So now imagine that type of a society. There's actually an episode of Black Mirror, a science fiction series, that plays on this theme, but I believe they've published that before China implemented this. And so you as an individual now have to essentially play by the rules of the system, or you cannot live your life. So this is the opposite of the pursuit of happiness, right? And why is this possible in China? Well, this wouldn't be necessarily possible in the United States, because here the government does not control the rewards or the possibilities of punishing someone. It certainly has the legal branch, but that legal branch is fairly independent of the legislative branch. And so that's not the case in China, right? So the system has used all of these technological capabilities with its political realities to cook up this perfect storm. And so along those lines, I then looked a little bit deeper and said, okay, what else is China up to? And essentially, all the way back in 2017, they formulated a national strategy on AI. They invested $150 billion to build a national AI industry. And as they do things in China, they think long term. They have a long history of 5-year plans, but on AI, they actually went out further. Their initial goal was to catch up with the US by 2020, then have select breakthroughs by 2025, and ultimately become the world's premier AI innovation center. In our society, investment in AI is largely driven by sort of capital interests, right? People have startups. These startups get funding. They eventually get sold. People make money off of it. That's not necessarily the case in China. So China is commandeering national resources. They have thousands of people acquiring data science and computer science degrees to fuel this. They're building their own chip manufacturing facilities to become independent of US supply of technology. And so this is, as I mentioned, the perfect storm, because China has, in fact, the power. The government has the power, and they have the financial resources now to engineer such a strategy, whereas we have to piece it together from the contributions of many individuals and organizations. So that leads me to, if I was a dictator, what would I wish for, and how could technology fulfill that? And so here it goes, right? My first wish would be that my subjects essentially tell me on their own volition and with joy in their hearts what they are doing, which people do through social media, where they are going, which again is social media, maps, devices that register in certain Wi-Fi networks or with cell towers, who their friends are and what they are doing, which again is social media, who they are meeting with. And there we have social media, but we also have devices recognizing other devices, who they do business with, who they admire, who they like, who they follow, and so forth, what they are buying. And yeah, that would have been utopian. In a historical context, people would never tell me these things if I am the government, but now they are in fact doing it. They're putting it out on social media. Now there's a complication, which is if they are doing that on American-owned social media, if they're doing it on Facebook, LinkedIn, and so forth, then I, as a government, obviously cannot access that information. But if I can create my own Chinese version of all those things, then all of a sudden it is possible. And it was the first time when I sort of compiled this list that it made perfect sense to me why the Chinese government would allow someone like Jack Ma to essentially become the Chinese Jeff Bezos. But when he steps out of line, they quickly put him back in line. I would then have maybe a second wish as a dictator, which is, well, if somebody doesn't play ball, if somebody doesn't want to use these channels to tell me what they're doing, I want to be able to assess that alternatively, right? So that's when I put security cameras everywhere with recognition capabilities, the emotion recognition, and so forth. And now my final request would be that all of this information can be compiled in a massive data warehouse, and that's where we have big data, we have the cloud, and I can now identify the patterns and make predictions about the future, about individual choices. And that is where AI comes into play. So, to be honest, the Nazis could not have designed it any better, as long as you can control the data and the access to that data that flows through these systems. It is really quite scary. And it should be a warning signal for all of us. We still have certain protections in terms of our data, but as technology companies consolidate further and further, the ability of any single company to actually compile a meaningful amount of this information is frightening. And while they may not use it to establish a totalitarian society, they have other means of what they can do with that data, or even sell it to the government. And that's where, we don't know what the NSA, the National Security Agency data warehouse looks like and who all is selling the data to them. So maybe we are not completely far away. For those of you who want to dig in a little bit deeper, there are two interesting articles here that I've referenced with the links to it. And so this Orwellian utopia of total control of the individual through the government and through technology, mainly, we are on the doorstep to that reality, and we have to have our guard up every moment to not allow that to become our reality here in the United States. Any reactions, thoughts, comments, or questions to this first chapter? All right, then we're going to flip the paradigm, right? So now we've looked at what can be done with technology if you don't have the guardrails of democracy. Now we're going to look at the concept of democracy and say, how would that actually be represented within technology, and can we find examples of that? So a couple of principles here, right? What would make a technology democratic? The first principle would be universal access and participation, right? If everyone can access a technology, technologically, geographically, and financially, right, then that makes the technology demographic. If there are barriers to access, if people cannot get in because they cannot afford it, if people cannot use the technology because it requires a certain skill set to use it, or if there are other barriers, firewalls, if you will, to using the technology, then that would sort of stand in the way of making it a truly democratic technology. If we go down, there are some technologies that basically distribute the record of the information that they contain. Blockchain is one of those examples. In a traditional database, you typically have one owner of the database, and we have to trust that owner. We submit our data, but that owner could delete data. Sometimes you have to call customer service to have the spelling of your name changed in a system. And so blockchain operates a little bit differently. It was designed to cut out the middleman and sort of create a different way of doing business. In blockchain, you have what's called a distributed ledger. There are many copies of the information, and the system basically checks itself against these different copies. So if any one participant in the system were to make an unauthorized change to the data, the other copies would reject that. In order to make any change, to log a new transaction, you have to publish that transaction, and then the system has to acknowledge it. Consensus has to be established, and then it is being recorded as a new piece in an endless chain of pieces, and that endless chain cannot be edited. So history cannot be changed. You could always go back and track what has happened. And we'll talk a little bit more about blockchain. So in principle, blockchain is meant to be a democratic technology. The next aspect here is sharing of resources. In the early days, you may recall sort of the battle between Apple and Microsoft for dominance of the PC market. And Apple had a more closed ecosystem. Microsoft had a slightly more open ecosystem, trying to work with others, but none of them were really open source. Neither Microsoft nor Apple said, here you go, here is sort of the secret sauce of our software. Here's the source code. And then came Linux, and Linux was sort of a counter design to the big power of software companies. And the founder of Linux basically said, here, I've created an operating system, and I give to the world all the information that you need. And it attracted a lot of programmers that said, I can work with this. In fact, I can make it better. And here you go. Here are my improvements, right? So it became a, if you will, a community-owned repository. Now, still, there were companies making money off of that because they were creating solutions with that open source software, and they created services around it. So it was not that this was a non-profit operation, but it was an open source. Anybody had the opportunity to contribute to it or to draw from it. And usually there's some level of community policing and so forth. And then ultimately we have the protection of individual rights and privacy in technology. And so there's a paradigm shift that we've talked about a couple of times. Today, most of us do not own our data. If I have signed the user agreement with Facebook, with Microsoft, and so forth, whatever data I am generating on their platform, they own the data. And there are some emerging privileges and rights where I can ask them to delete my data or not to use my data any further, but principally, I don't own my data. So anything pertaining to me, Oliver Buechse, is spread all over the world in different software companies, financial institutions, health providers own that, and they can decide what to do with that data. I just got a letter from a dermatology firm here in Green Bay that said, oh, sorry, your information got stolen. We don't know for sure that it got stolen, but it might have included your address, your name, your social security number, et cetera, et cetera. So we encourage you to monitor your records. Great. So now, I have to think about who all has that information, and the list is daunting. There's a different paradigm in which only I own that information. And whenever somebody wants to do business with me or they want to use that information, for example, the entire history of my health records, I have to release it to them on a token for a period of time. And when that release, that authorization expires, they no longer have access. It stays with me in my personal record. So that is an empowerment of the individual rather than a fragmentation of the individual. So those are some principles, and let's dig a little bit deeper here. The state of Connecticut is one of the first to pioneer universal broadband. So they passed a House bill, and they basically said, we want everyone to have broadband access. So they need to address the geographic reach, because obviously they need to either put towers or fiber or access to satellite-based broadband everywhere. It's a little easier to do that in Connecticut than probably in Alaska, right? So it doesn't shock me that it wasn't Alaska who came up with this initiative. They need to ensure that subscriptions to those services and access to devices are economically affordable. And then they need to ensure that the people really have the skills to use that, and that they have the mindset to use that. We talked about that in last week's session as well. So you can't just say, here's a bill that mandates that we build more broadband towers. There are a couple of layers beyond that that also need to be fulfilled. The next thing you need to think about is, what's the security of the data that's being transferred? Whatever access modality you use, is it truly safe? If you go to McDonald's to access their Wi-Fi system, it may say, others could be observing what you're doing in our Wi-Fi system because it's not highly secured. And ultimately, as the government, it's nice to say we want this, but there's a cost to doing it. Here in Brown County, Troy Streckenbach was a pioneer of sort of government-sponsored fiber networks, and it wasn't cheap, right? But once it was put in place and the schools were connected and certain parts of the business district were connected and the government was connected, you could develop some value proposition to that and attract additional business and make the city more attractive to people. So there is a business case to be considered in that as well. Access has another connotation, access to the digital economy. You know, what if we created a marketplace? So there's a marketplace called Etsy, where essentially you could sell anything that you make on your own, arts and crafts. People sell seeds and plants. And it was meant to be sort of an alternative place, and it's growing rapidly. It now has over 4.3 million sellers. And you know, if you need something really quirky and unusual, you'll find it on Etsy. Now, while in principle this is meant to be a democratic approach, their governance model also had a couple of weaknesses. So they had to strengthen it because people were selling some illegal stuff or inappropriate stuff. So they now need to sort of put in place stronger moderation, stronger oversight into that marketplace to keep it within legal limits. Now, on the flip side, we have another marketplace that we all like to go to, which is Amazon. And I have to admit, you know, if in doubt, I go to Amazon, right? Because I know with an almost 100% certainty that they'll have it. I know that it'll get here fast, probably free shipping, and I may not find it any cheaper or faster anywhere else. So why even bother, right? But the downside of that is that Amazon, like a kraken, right, is spreading its arms wider and wider, disrupting many other retailers, disrupting the delivery industry, the distributors, now even starting to put Amazon private label products into their stores so they can basically undercut competing brands. And you know, some observers basically say, you know, they don't believe that Amazon is even making any money with their retail business, but it's such a powerful platform against which they can deploy analytics and software services that they basically use this retail platform to continuously grow and increase their market share. So that's the downside, where it looks like a great benefit to everyone, but in reality, it's a single company governed by a very small group of people who control more and more of commerce, of information, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, it's not a great value proposition for anyone trying to compete with Amazon. Let's talk about blockchain. I mentioned earlier sort of the principal idea of blockchain. It was a revolutionary idea. An anonymous person, Satoshi, wrote the code, gave it to the world. It sort of came with the currency of Bitcoin. Bitcoin is essentially the reward for creating the encryption layer on blockchain. And it was a well thought out system. It lived for a long time in sort of a subculture of aficionados, but eventually it hit the hype cycle, and it's been sort of on track to becoming more and more popular. The idea was, you know, anyone could could use this blockchain technology to design a system in which transactions are highly secure, they cannot be manipulated, they are auditable, and so it seemed perfect to cut out the middlemen. For example, banks. If I want to sell my house to anyone else, I have the bank involved, I have realtors involved, I have title and escrow involved, because I can't really trust that I get paid at the end of the day, right? In a blockchain, if somebody could prove to me that they have the money, if they could prove to me that they have purchased and sold houses in the past, I could just, you know, basically surrender ownership and instead take ownership of the digital money that is the equivalent value of my home. Now, if it's such a great system, why has it not taken off? In order to build a system in which you can sort of do this, you need to get a lot of people to agree. For example, in a supply chain, you need to get the grower of the tomato, the distributor of the tomato, the warehouse, the store. They all need to agree that all the information regarding the transactions pertaining to that tomato all the way into the store are all logged and recorded on the blockchain. And if one party doesn't want to play along, then you either have to kick them out and find a new party, or you just can't implement that system and you have to continue to live with a patchwork of software solutions. Very few have the power to force that. So Walmart, for example, has been able to implement blockchain in their supply chain because they have an incredible market power. As a result, because it's a little unwieldy and difficult to manage, some companies came out with a compromise. They said, well, we're not going to do a real, true public blockchain. We'll call it a private blockchain, which means we control the rules, we control who participates in the system, we define what consensus really is. And these solutions have gone out mainly for their sort of strength of encryption and security, but they're not really honoring the original democratic principles of the blockchain. And then it also had a little bit of a dubious reputation because the underworld was using Bitcoin to sort of anonymously conduct illegal transactions. And so that kept a lot of established companies sort of on the sidelines. Another downside is that to build this technology and to sustain this technology, it takes an incredible amount of energy because in order to secure that encryption layer, a lot of computer power is required. So Elon Musk used that recently as an argument to sell all of his Bitcoin and say, you know, this is not an eco-friendly technology. So the big breakthrough of blockchain has not yet occurred, but the promise of that technology is out there. And there are a few platforms that use the similar idea, but they don't have sort of this, you know, energy issue or some of the other issues that came with the original blockchain. So we may still see the emergence of this democratic technology on a bigger scale. Open source, I described that to you earlier in a bit more detail. Many programmers contribute. It's like, you know, almost like a community market, right? Where everybody drops off what they have, and in return, you sort of take what you need without having to pay for it. And the benefit is, you know, it's fast, it's flexible. You can build something at a much, much lower cost. The problems occur when you need to take what you have built and connect it to your other systems. There's not a guarantee that it's going to be compatible. So maybe it's better to stick with a Microsoft solution or an IBM solution because you're going to know it's going to be compatible unless you're willing to build those interfaces yourself. There may also be a learning curve in working with that software, or you know, let's say multiple people are working on a similar problem and they come up with different solutions. Now, you know, which of these solutions is going to emerge? So there could be disputes within the community of developers, but usually they work themselves out over time, or multiple solutions start to exist in parallel. It's essentially a different universe, a different logic of developing and commercializing software. So these are examples that democratic principles can exist within technology, but most of these examples have not yet hit their prime. You know, sort of they're living alive in the shadows. They have not become dominant technologies. And, you know, in some cases, because those who have the dominant technologies have an interest in preserving their monopoly, their grip on the world. So they're not necessarily releasing that. All right, so now let's examine how new technologies are impacting the pillars of democracy. And I found a first article that had like 10 pillars of democracy, or 11, and I was like, I'll never get through this. So for the sake of inclusiveness, here they are, but I'm going to use this framework, which is a little simpler. Pillars of democracy are defined here as justice, equality, freedom, and representation. And we're going to take a quick look to see how each of them is impacted by new technologies. So let's start with justice. Crime detection is making use of new technologies in a variety of ways. There's one called ShotSpotter. There are sound sensors all over a city, for example, city of Chicago, and they can detect the specific sound wave pattern of a shot. And because they have them in different spots and sound travels at a certain speed, if that sound pattern is picked up, it is being triangulated, and the ShotSpotter can identify exactly where that shot originated. So instead of just saying, hey, shots fired, you could say shots fired on the third floor of 2020 Washington Street, right? And the police can be deployed much more specifically rather than one ambulance to find the victim of the shooting or to potentially arrest the shooter. More on the white collar crime side, insider trading, if you think about how many trades are being conducted every day in the stock markets, it's extremely difficult to identify which of them might have some, inappropriateness to them. But with AI, you can identify patterns in those trades, and you can spot sort of, based on market movements up and down after a trade, which ones do you want to flag? How are the people who traded those stocks potentially related to that company, or are they related to people who are related to the company? So with big data and having connections between people, AI can be very powerful in identifying at least the suspected activities of insider trading. Similarly, in banks, banks have essentially become a government law enforcement agency to detect financial crimes. The amount of analysis and reporting that banks have to do on all of their transactions is mind-boggling. With the Patriot Act after 9/11, banks were forced to essentially report anything and everything. One of the problems was that the reporting guidelines were such that banks were reporting, 1,000 suspicious activities every day from every branch or from every region, and it just all went into a big government black hole. Most of it could not be analyzed. Most of it actually turned out to be nothing. And now with deploying AI and other pattern recognition tools, banks have a much better hit rate to say, this is the real fraudulent activity versus this is just sort of, it happens to look like it, but it was just an innocent cash deposit, or it was an innocent withdrawal of amounts. In the physical world, again, patrol cars are roaming our streets, and police officers have a lot of experience where they need to be, different days of the week, different times of the day, how they coordinate themselves. But again, with the use of AI, with having the complete crime history and the patterns over time, the patterns in a city, you could actually optimize how you deploy these police cars. And if one car goes off patrol, you could redirect the other cars to cover a certain area. Robots are hitting the police force. Dubai already has a police robot. I don't think is like Inspector Clouseau level complicated cases, but if robots can take on simple tasks such as directing traffic or answering questions, that frees up their colleagues for higher value activities. In all of these cases, we have to ask ourselves, how reliable is the technology? And what is the role of technology vis-a-vis humans? Does the technology actually make the decision, or does it just point out a pattern? Does it give the human a choice on where they should be looking or where they should be driving their car? But so it augments and empowers the human to do their job better rather than eliminating the human from that job. AI in sentencing, we've talked about that last time a little bit. There were examples of racial bias in facial recognition. So judges have to make lots of decisions, and anyone who has to work all day and make difficult decisions knows you can get tired. So an analysis showed that judges are more lenient in the morning. So that's just bad luck if you get a grumpy judge in the afternoon. It shouldn't be that way. At a minimum, AI could detect those patterns. It could say, hey, it was the same crime, the same severity, but we got two different length of sentence issues, right? So maybe there could be a committee then that adjusts the sentencing based on those similarities and patterns. We've also talked last time about risk or needs assessment predictors. How likely is somebody to become an offender again, to commit another crime? Or in the case of needs assessment, does somebody have special needs? Do they have drug addictions or other health issues? Do they have social issues that need to be addressed? So maybe we put them in an alternative program rather than just sending them straight to jail. In any of these cases, relying on the AI entirely should have a very high burden of proof. And we've seen last time that in many cases, the system works just fine. But when it does not work, the outliers tend to be racially skewed. Here's another example, a totally different technology. If you are a prison guard, you have a difficult job. You have to sort of keep track, make sure the general procedures are followed. But then within that general procedure, you have to keep track of individual inmates, especially when they're all out in the hallways or maybe out in the recreation yard. And that can be overwhelming. So what do you look for? You make sure there's no major fights, nobody goes down to the ground. And if they do, you intervene. Well, at that point, it could be too late. There's a new technology that essentially equips every inmate with a worn sensor, right? And so now the AI can analyze, are people of a group, are they sort of conspiring? Are they all in the same place, maybe having a club meeting, and should we be concerned about that? Or is the ratio of staff to inmates in a certain corner of the building or in a certain part of the yard concerning, and should we send additional staff? Or should we at least send that staff a warning, you are at risk of being overwhelmed, overpowered before that actually happens? Or two inmates who are enemies, they all of a sudden they get closer and closer and closer to each other. Let's identify that, let's flag that and get the staff there before they can beat up on or kill each other. Another use of sensors is for suicide watch. We've heard many celebrity examples of people killing themselves in jail. Sometimes foul play is suspected. You can't have eyes 24/7 on everyone, but there are certain sensors, heart rate sensors, or even automatic interpretation of a camera feed that could help lower the suicide rate among inmates. So again, last week we talked about examples that some of these technologies have a racial bias because the data that was used to train the technology was not truly representative, or the questions being used to develop the technology had a bias themselves against certain races, but in some cases also technology being used to actually overcome racial bias. So if you want to learn more about those examples, take a look at last week's presentation on racial bias. So let's talk about equality. Here's the big dilemma, right? If you take AI and some of the related technologies that are powered by AI, it can take on an increasing number of tasks, cognitive tasks. It can empower machines to do more and more in terms of physical tasks, right? And so this can go one of two ways. The first way is that a lot of people will lose their job because they're just not needed anymore. We have robots doing the jobs. We have expert systems doing the jobs. And what do all these people do? Well, either they live off of unemployment for a while and then maybe really struggle, or we find ways we evolve as a society where the productivity gains, the monetization of all of these advantages are distributed in a way that benefits everyone. So that could be the end of mundane labor and the era of creativity and focus on higher value activities. And so which way are we going to go? Well, right now it's going more the upper path because we have a sort of free markets capitalist society. And if you develop the technology, you become a billionaire and everybody else has to pay for the technology, either directly through money or by sort of surrendering their data. And it's not just a decision we here in the US could make to say, oh, let's be more kumbaya and share the benefits, because it's an international race. Putin said it, whoever leads in AI will rule the world. So you can't really afford to fall behind. You can't let China necessarily absorb that superpower status. And that's why nobody in the US is suggesting that we sort of slow down and smell the roses. It's like, keep going, keep going, keep going. We need to have the best weapons and we need to have the best AI and the best technology. The shared prosperity principle sort of lives in an elite think tank society where people say, wouldn't it be nice if we could do that? Wouldn't it be nice if we could all agree on that? But it's like climate change. They all come together and they agree that we need to save the planet. But then in reality, the net emissions that are being pumped out seem to still be going up because more developing countries are actually burning more fossil fuels, and there's other drivers as well. So this is going to be a real difficult one. There's a lot of barriers, and these are not new now to you. There are barriers of access, geographic access, financial access, barriers of awareness and preparedness. If you don't even know that these new technologies are coming for your job, you can't get ready for it. I often share a website called willrobotstakemyjob.com with students, and it's very eye-opening for them. It's like, oh my gosh, I'm about to graduate as an accountant, and this says accountants are going to be replaced with a 94% likelihood. So what am I doing here? And then preparing our students for this technological future, making sure coding skills are embedded as early as possible, that girls acquire technology skills, that we overcome sort of that STEM bias, STEM gender bias. And then we need to ensure diverse representation, both from a racial perspective as well as from a gender perspective. And if we don't do that, we've seen example after example where that leads to flawed technology that is then being deployed and making bad decisions leading to bad outcomes. Let's look at freedom. And I'm not going to cover freedom of speech, religion, press, and assembly. I'm going to focus a little bit more on freedom of speech. So freedom of speech, everybody can say what they want, but not everybody is heard in the same manner, right? This shows you the most popular politicians in social media. So if Barack Obama says something, 194 million are likely going to hear it. And then you see there are some international politicians, some of them I've never heard of. Yoko Widodo, I have no idea who that is. I assume it's a Japanese politician, but I don't know, right? And then you wonder, it's like, well, where's everyone else? Well, much, much further down the line, right? And so if you only have 1 million followers or 100,000 followers, then what you say is not going to be picked up, at least not through this channel. And can CNN or Fox News in the long term help you equalize that? Maybe not, because they are increasingly also focusing on what is being said on social media. And that explains this phenomenon that a lot of people go to the ones who have the big megaphone and try to get their endorsement, their agreement, because that can completely change the trajectory of your political career. And that raises another question. Now, all of a sudden, technology companies could turn off that megaphone, as was the case with Donald Trump after January 6th, when Twitter and Facebook suspended his accounts. By what rules are they going to make that decision? Is it an internal decision? Does it go to the court? All of a sudden, technology companies, big tech, essentially has the power to shift the balance of political races by turning off megaphones that maybe people had counted on to deliver their messages. So that's not really freedom of Freedom of speech, you can say what you want, but this is sort of the inequality in the being heard. Here's the inequality in what you say. You know, some of it is true, some of it is not true. It became sort of a fashion trend to label anything you didn't want to hear as fake news. And technology can help generate fake news, and it can help fight fake news. But there's a problem. Generating it is quick. You can identify specific target audiences very quickly with AI now to say, you know, this, if I put it in this social media channel through this communicator at this particular time, I'm most likely to reach the people who want to or need to hear it. And then you can use bots or fake accounts to amplify it, and all of a sudden you create the impression that this is all over the internet. It now gets picked up by news outlets, it's trending, and because it's trending, now everybody wants to get a glimpse at it. So this cycle of generating fake news, technology empowered, is very quick. The detection takes much longer. So in order to debunk it, people deploy fact checkers and image analysis, et cetera, but even once they determine it is fake, it was fake, and they say it and they repeat it, a lot of people still believe that it wasn't fake because they had heard it first, they had heard it multiple times, it had been reinforced within their network of thinking. So this is going to be really difficult. There's a report that I'm referencing here by the European Union. Again, the Europeans are a little bit ahead of us there. And they give a couple of conclusions, which I will reference in a moment. Here is how this could be taken to the next level, right? Fake news, if it's sort of a sentence that was said by somebody on Twitter, that's one thing. But what if I actually watched Barack Obama say it himself? You know, if you see it, you believe it, right? But you can actually put words into his mouth with voice technology and with image technology. So you could create a deep fake video now of anyone, really. And what if that happened at the eve of the election? By the time this has been debunked, the damage has long been done, and there's really no way to remediating that anymore. So the power of technology in creating impressions, correct or false, is incredible. Here's what the report says about stopping the fake news. And I'm not going to read every one of those, but the commonality among them is they take time, they take effort, right? And in this sort of fight between the avalanche of fake news that comes at you quickly and then the systematic eradication of that, guess which side is going to win? Now, there is a way of turning the dial. You could empower the technology itself to detect the fake news, but now effectively you are limiting free speech, right? So if we want to curb fake news, we have to reduce the privilege, the right of anyone or everyone to say what they want to say. And so now, is that still democratic? This is a really big conundrum. Finally, representation. So the cost of unfair elections can vary, right? If it's a perception of unfair elections, it paralyzes the democratic process. People just don't believe in it anymore. They think people were elected unduly. They challenge it. They audit everything, right? And this happened on both sides of the political spectrum. This is not just a problem of one side. You could have outside influences trying to sway voters or even succeed in swaying voters. That's the claim that was made in 2016, that somebody influenced people in the last minute, and that allowed Donald Trump to win. You could, in fact, have incorrect or fraudulent results. The wrong representative could be elected. That's a bigger risk. Or if it's a systemic manipulation, as we have probably seen in some other countries take place time and time again, where dictators get reelected with 95% of the vote, then you can sustain a regime essentially without or against the true will of the people. So here are a couple of examples of that. there is strong evidence of outside attempts to influence our elections. Now, so far, they haven't found that they are breaking through, but the mere fact that China and Russia and Iran and whoever else is trying to interfere could be used by the party that does not win to say, hey, there was probably some foul play. We can't concede. We have to examine that. And that is an example of that paralysis of the political process. Even if ultimately they can't change the votes themselves, maybe they can hack democratic institutions, they can release damaging information. So it is, any way you look at it, it is interference in the election process. Remember, Cambridge Analytica 2016 was a big deal. What was it that they actually did? They acquired a lot of data that was based on Facebook data. And they acquired it from another outlet, Global Sciences, that had conducted a massive research study, and people had participated in that research study, but people had never consented to the use of that information by another party. And so Cambridge Analytica bought all of that data, and they created psychometric profiles. Who are you? How do you tick? What do you like? What do you hate? What do you worry about? What issues do you care about? And then based on those psychometric profiles, they used very targeted messaging, targeting the right people with the right messages to try to change their election behavior. And so the big concern was that they had acquired the data in an inappropriate manner, but the bigger concern that I had all along was that they actually had the technology to identify who and then to match up the messaging with those people. And that's not a technology that was proprietary to them. A lot of companies have that. And so how do we, guard ourselves from this level of influence, or do we just have to accept it as part of the reality going forward? Could blockchain make a difference? I've explained blockchain earlier. So some of the election challenges are you need to validate who somebody is, but at the same time, you protect their vote, right? So you have to walk in, you have to show your ID, then you get your ballot, then you go into a secret booth, you fill it out, and you stick it into the box, right? So we do that in person today. Could we do this online? Well, how do you validate that somebody is who they say they are online? There's a thing called digital identity that can do that. And through encryption in multiple layers, you could actually allow that person to see how they voted, but don't allow anyone else to see how they voted. Everybody else just gets to see the vote, but not who cast the vote. I, for example, I may not remember how I voted in every election, but it would be nice to go back and see my election record and say, hey, yep, that's still how I voted. Nobody else changed my vote there. The next challenge is correctly tallying the results. So we have a Democrat and a Republican and maybe some independents sitting there, two people at a time agreeing on what that vote is, making a mark. And so that is obviously fraud with problems, and it can take a lot of time. Recounts give different results than the original counts. In a blockchain-based system, this would not be necessary. The results would be instantaneous. The polls close and boom, you push the button and the results would be there. You can also go back and audit it with a very high accuracy because you cannot falsify any of those records. And then finally, the transmission of data. We've had some issues in the 2020 election where an election official maybe transposed some of the results. So there's another human error component. The same logic that applied here in step 2 would apply in step 3. The challenge, if you did all of that, is still a lot of people don't trust it. They don't want it. They don't want to vote online. Estonia, who is most advanced in digital identities, only gets about 30% of the people to actually vote online. A small community in Switzerland did a trial election and it worked fine. There were no issues. But afterwards, most people said, I'd rather do it the old way. I don't know that this new way really works. Only 20% of people said, yeah, this was great. Let's keep doing it this way. And if you move to a technology-based voting system, you may create a new inequality. Maybe some people, again, don't have access or they don't understand it, whereas our current voting system is well established and there's a lot of support layers in getting people through it. The final comments are around democracy as a shaping force. So it's not just that technology is the actor and democracy is sort of the screen on which the act is being played out. Here's an example of a community, a municipality fighting back. San Francisco outlawed the use of facial recognition technology by its government, including its law enforcement, probably based on their understanding of the flaws that can be present in that technology. So a municipality can do that if there is no state or federal law overriding it, right? So any municipality, Green Bay, De Pere, could essentially make decisions. But in order to make those decisions, you actually need to understand the issues and how many technologies are there, how many issues are there. So before you pass any kind of law or ordinance, you need to understand that, and you need to overcome everything else you're working on. Here's a Wisconsin example. At some point, Wisconsin was sort of worried about should we or should we not have autonomous vehicles on our roads. So they created, the legislature in Madison created a steering committee. They assessed the issue and they issued a report to then Governor Walker. So that was an example of taking ownership. But autonomous vehicles is only one issue. Something similar has not been done on AI, on blockchain, on drones, on robots, right? There's 100 more steering committees we would have to create to ultimately catch up. So I think the biggest challenge here is that trying to do this at the local level, maybe even the state level, is not going to work. Europe is showing us how to do it. They have public-private partnerships in the design of responsible AI and creating a framework for responsible AI, and generally awareness and education among legislators just has to increase on that. So in conclusion, my key takeaways for you here are that technology has the potential to impact all pillars of our democracy, and the adverse influences right now have the upper hand. Totalitarian regimes have recognized that, and they are using technology extensively to sustain themselves. And our democratic institutions right now are simply outmatched. There are too many technologies. They are evolving too quickly. We are never catching up with putting our arms around them and establishing the proper guidance. So, are we at risk? Is our democracy at risk through new technologies? I would say it certainly is. There are people paying attention. There are people trying to counter that. But ultimately, we will have to see if, as a society, we will become more or less democratic as time passes on. I know I'm 5 minutes over, but if anybody has questions, I'd be happy to entertain a couple of questions here at the end. Anything in the chat?
No, there haven't been any messages in the chat.
All right. Okay, very good. So this is the end of our presentation here today. Next week, we will be talking about new technologies and the future of our planet. So we're going to look at climate change, water scarcity, environmental impact, so a very different dimension. And we will, again, look at both sides, how are technologies contributing to the sort of dangers to our planet, but also what is their potential to provide solutions. Thank you very much for attending today, and I hope to see you again next week. Thank you very much.